Have you ever seen an image or, a view of some place that you just want to see so badly with your own eyes? This first happened to me in my freshman year French class. I was in French 2, learning about the passé composé, which is the past tense in French. And then we watched a documentary about Mont St Michel. If you're unfamiliar with what Mont St Michel is, it is a cathedral that takes up the size of an island off the coast of Normandy in France. And I remember watching this documentary about it. In that first opening shot, you just see the large sprawling cathedral across you know, the the island, and then you see the entire, English Channel as its backdrop, and it was breathtaking. I knew in that moment that this was something I needed to see with my own eyes. It wasn't until many years later, after I was, went through college and through my professional career, that I finally had, the time and the money to invest in a trip to Europe. So I went on a trip to Europe in 2023 to attend a Star Wars convention of all things, Star Wars Celebration in London. Me and a friend had planned to attend together, and after attending the convention there in London, I took the bullet train through the Channel to Paris and stayed in Paris for the following week. And the first thing I did when I knew I was going to Europe is I looked up a day trip or, multi day trip, whatever I could find to get me to Le Mont Saint Michel for at least just a snippet of this trip. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. So here I am staying in Paris, and I I find a tour of Le Mont Saint Michel. It's a bus trip that leaves from the north side of Paris, and then it's a 4 hour bus ride to Le Mont Saint Michel up in Normandy. It's a 4 hour bus ride back. We got about a total of 6 hours of walking around the cathedral and such itself. And right before the trip, I had purchased my first DSLR, and I knew that this would be my moment where I could finally capture in my own eyes and through my amateur photography the view I've been longing for. So, you know, I remember taking the bus trip. It was 2 hours. They stopped at a French truck stop and then continued on for 2 more hours. And when we finally reached Normandy, there's, bus parking. And they had a shuttle bus that could take you from the parking lot to the base of the cathedral. And, I'm a fairly heavy set American white man. I was like 6'6", almost 400 pounds. And the tour guide wasn't too, was pretty straightforward. She's like, "You're going to want to take the shuttle." And I just straight up ignored her. As soon as I saw the Mont Saint Michel in the distance, I knew I needed to walk there and take a photo from a distance the way I'd first seen it in that documentary in high school. I remember that it wasn't a long distance or anything, maybe like a mile and a half, 2 miles from the parking lot to the base of the cathedral. So I wanted to get just on the edge of the beach so I could get a nice panning view, which is the photo you see present for this podcast. And man, I remember the entire bus trip up there. I was taking in the views of the Normandy countryside. It really put in perspective, like you watch World War II movies about battalions busting through cornrows and hedgerows and such, and like it really put into perspective the scale of that. Like, a hedgerow doesn't look like much on the silver screen, but in person, man, they are massive. Like, I can understand, like, it was treacherous to go through those, and no wonder it was such a difficult area to traverse. And then I remember once we got to about, maybe 20 minutes away from the parking lot for the Mont St Michel, we started seeing it, in the distance off the coastline. Like it started as just kind of a little blip in the horizon, and it just kept growing. And I remember, when we were about 10 minutes out and we turned down this one country road, and I got my first like full view of the cathedral. And man, it was everything I'd ever expected to see. Like it was awestruck. I was completely awestruck. It was very awe inspiring. Like uh, the history of the cathedral is very interesting too. I mean, I'm not going to read off any historical facts straight from a book or anything. I'm going to go off the top here. If I remember correctly, the reason why the cathedral was made on this island, so this island is inaccessible during high tide. During high tide, there's a water that comes up and will sometimes pour over the bridge that connects the mainland to the island. I think that the modern bridge, leaves it fairly accessible, 90% of the time, but still can spill over and make the entire island uninhabitable. But, I think the original reason for why this was created was, during like the Hundred-Year War between France and Britain. It was, a really easy way to fortify the cathedral. It's, it's it's pretty good way to keep your entire city safe if the only way you can get to it is by going through the water, especially especially with how rocky the coast is there in Normandy and the strong winds. It's fairly difficult to traverse. That was the other thing that really kind of took me off guard, was just how strong the wind was. I grew up in the state of Ohio and currently preside in the state of Kansas. And if you've ever been to the Midwest in the United States, windstorms are very common. Tornadoes are very common. And it was gale force winds the morning that I traveled to Normandy to see Le Mont St Michel. And it led me to, like, I looked up some, weather reports, and there had been, you know, I think they've had some tornadoes that happen in Normandy. It's a fairly rare occurrence to how often you see it in like the United States and Texas, Oklahoma, or parts of the Midwest, but it's not. It's possible you can have a tornado there, which then also added to perspective. Going back to World War II films and such, that landing at Normandy on D-Day. It's kind of crazy to think that along with how rough the conditions were in the landing boats and such, that also you could have had these gale force winds as well. I know if you watch, like Saving Private Ryan, they show how rough the conditions were on the water, and I completely understand now. Like, again, this was a random day in March in 2023, and it was like very rough conditions. So, anytime in, I imagine, winter and early spring, being in Normandy, I expect there's probably going to be a decent amount of wind whipping you around, to the point, like, shoot, I almost got knocked over once or twice from the wind. I was wearing a fairly thick windbreaker too, but I just wasn't expecting it. I had to start fortifying my stance a bit as I was doing this. So, after enduring the entire bus ride up to Normandy, including the stop at a French truck stop, which is actually kind of neat inside. I don't know if you've ever traveled to France, if you get a chance to stop at one of these truck stops up in Normandy. On the inside, it kind of reminds me of like the closest thing I could relate it to in the U.S. would be like, I'd call it a Buc-ee's light. If you've ever been to a Buc-ee's, it's really neat. All the amount of food that's available, but they also sell like merchandise, like T-shirts and stuff. at this French truck stop, they had like actual boutique like clothing you could purchase. They had, designer jackets, shoes, hiking shoes. And they just had like mannequins with these up, and you could go up to the counter and, tell them your sizes. They'd go pull them for you, and you could just purchase, complete new sets of clothing. I'd want to say like square footage wise, it kind of reminded me of the size of like a you know, truck stop here in the United States. It's relatively compact on the inside, but it was the layout that they used was just very clean. And funny enough, like that was my only time on my entire trip to France. I didn't get a single croissant the entire time I was in France, which seems kind of bogus to most people, but I just it never came up. Like whenever I was hungry, I was sitting down for actual meals. I didn't stop at snack, but I did get at this French truck stop a prepackaged pain au chocolat. Just uh, I know in America we call them just chocolate croissants, but technically it's not considered a croissant in France. But even with this being like a prepackaged pastry, it was phenomenal. Like one of the best chocolate croissants I've had in my life. Like really good. And I mean, again, I'm a fat guy, so you can trust me. That, but they also had, a really cool kind of like artisanal coffee vending machine that I got some espresso from. And it was just really neat. Like there's a lot of areas outside. There's like a children's playground. There was a bunch of picnic areas you could sit outside, and it was very. It felt very kind of Americanized compared to everywhere else I'd been in France. You look at a bunch of photos of Paris or some of the other big cities in France, and it has a very unique architecture, a very unique kind of vibe and feel to it. And this what I think it might just be the mindset us Americans just go on a bunch of cross country traveling trips, the classic American road trip. And I know it kind of just gave me that sense of being at home, or it gave me a comforting feeling seeing this truck stop. A lot, but enduring the bus ride and enduring getting through that stop and such, and it was also cool because the bus that I'd purchased that trip through, it was the trip overall was like $140, and again, it's just a day trip, 4 hours there, 6 hours to stay, and 4 hours back. And regardless, though, it was just very neat to see that they had the tour guide for the bus spoke French, English, and Spanish, because there are people on the trip who were traveling from Spain, or there's some folks obviously domestic to France, and obviously, different English speakers on the bus. There are probably some other foreign nationals as well, but it was a very unique group, and it was just an overall very cool experience to go on a road trip through Normandy with uh, this melting pot of folks. But during that long trip, and then hiking up the side of the shore to finally snap this photo shown in the cover art for this episode, and it was everything I ever expected it to be. Like, you know it was very pretty overcast. I waited probably 15-20 minutes just standing in the spot I took this photo to get some better lighting. I played with every single setting on my camera imaginable, trying to get the best photo I could in this moment, because I knew if I ever came back again, it would be long after. So I wanted to have something as, a personal reminder about how important this was to me. And it it met all my expectations. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat. And I think just getting to this spot to take this photo was worth the money, hands down. No, like easily my favorite memory from this trip to Europe. Like I did a lot of cool stuff on this trip, as I'll disclose in future episodes. Like, but I I just can't get over how amazing this specific view was. You know, off the coastline of the Mont St Michel, just taking it in. And you know, Mont St Michel is relatively famous for being used to portray things like Hogwarts and the country and Tangled. You know, it's used in pop culture. It's just such a beautiful location. Like the way that the entire island's been built up into this cathedral is just awe-struck and awe-inspiring. It was amazing. And I definitely, you know, I did the full tour of the entire cathedral. I went through all the different shops in the castle town. And I had a very great day and great trip overall to the Mont Saint Michel. And I'll disclose it more into it in a few episodes following this. But I just want to, you know, use this moment to really push, like if there's something that you're dying to see out there, you know, you just need to see it with your own eyes. It is worth it usually. Almost every single time. I'm very fortunate to have been in the position to, you know, afford both the time and the, you know, money to afford this kind of trip. And I I'm thankful every day for the opportunities God has given me to, you know, make the make this kind of trip and experience happen, and hope that it helps empower someone out there that's been, you know, holding off on taking the leap and jumping into a big trip like this. Cuz man, I knew that day, you know, when I was in high school, that I had to see this with my own eyes. And it literally like lived in my head consistently. Like it would come back up every other year. It seemed like I was like, man, I really need to get there and see this with my own eyes. I remember having a conversation with my parents at one point when I was in college, and I looked into doing a summer trip to France that would have gotten me like a French history minor or something like that. And I knew uh, I was almost got into that trip and into that program just so I could go on this, you know, side quest of seeing the Mont Saint Michel. But man, I I'm really glad I finally found the opportunity and went for it. And it was beautiful. It was wonderful. And this has been a snapshot with the story. Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested to learn more about, you know, this trip that I took in general, and, you know, more about French and European architecture, or, you know, just neat views I found while on the trip, please tune back in. Uh, I think also linked below is a link to my Shopify page where you can purchase a canvas of any photo shown in any of my podcast episodes. If you purchase these, it helps support the podcast and keeps it afloat, but also don't feel like encouraged or forced like you have to do it. But I think the views are pretty cool. If you do too, feel free to support us. Thank you and have a great day.